welcome to this next module where we're going to discuss the directing a project process. If you're following in your Prince2 manual, you'll need to be in chapter 15. And as usual, remember any additional notes or annotations or highlighting that you make in the manual are acceptable, and you will be able to utilize those annotations and notes during your practitioner exam, provided they are hard written into the manual. Now, you'll recall again that the foundation course covered the purpose, objectives, and the context of the process. And so we're going to build on that. And if you did the course a little while ago, remember to go back and reread those sections of the manual, or even better, if you still have access to it, go and review this section in the foundation level course before continuing. So the directing a project process, you'll recall, is triggered at the end of the starting up a project process. In other words, it's triggered by the project manager's request to initiate the project. That submission of the project brief along with the initiation stage plan to the project board is what triggers the directing a project process. And once the directing a project process has started, it's a little bit different to the other processes in that, largely speaking, with the starting up a project process and the initiating a project process, they start and end within a single chunk of time, whereas the directing a project process starts at the point in time when it's triggered by the project manager's request to initiate, but it is a long, protracted process that lasts for the entire life of the Prince2 project. And in actual fact, the final activity of the directing a project process will be the final activity of the Prince2 project. So it starts at the beginning and it ends at the end. And all of the activities that make up the directing a project process are executed by the project board. Again, you'll recall that figure 13.1, where we looked at the different management levels and the process map, one over the other. You'll recall that the directing a project process belongs to the directing level of management. So that implies that these activities that make up this process are executed by the directing level of management, which we know to be the project board in the Prince2 project. Now, no management products are created during the directing a project process, but the project board rather provide approvals for the management documents or the management products produced in the other processes, and obviously provide authorizations for the project to move forward from the pre-project phase into initiation, and then ultimately into management stages, one after the other, and then right at the end, obviously approval for the project to be closed down. Let's have a look at an overview of the process and how each of the activities, the flow of them, before drilling down on each of the activities in more detail. So if you want to follow in your handbook, you're looking at figure 15.1, the overview of the directing a project process. So there it is, and you'll see again inside the dotted lines is the directing a project process. Each of the activities is indicated, they're named, and there are 5 different activities that make up the process. You'll also notice that this diagram is a little busier below and above than some of the others, because there's a lot of interaction between the other processes in the Prince2 method and the directing a project process. But bear in mind that the interactions shown here are only between the directing a project process and those processes, and not between those processes themselves. But let's start on the left and work our way to the right. So we know that the starting up a project process took place. The project brief would have been created with the initiation stage plan submitted to the board for approval, and that first activity of the directing a project process, which we've spoken about a number of times now, is authorize initiation. And during authorize initiation, the board will review and approve the outputs of the starting up a project process. In other words, they'll review the project brief, they'll review the initiation stage plan, and we'll get either a green light or a red light. A red light at this point simply means we go home, we evaporate, nothing to do. If we get the green light, of course, we move along to the initiation stage. That would trigger effectively the initiating a project process. Now, we've just covered the initiating a project process. We know that once the initiating a project process has run its course and we're assembling the project initiation documentation, we also trigger the managing a stage boundary process. So the outputs of initiating a project process would go up into the second activity, authorize a project, but we also know that the managing a stage boundary process would be triggered. So the managing a stage boundary process would then run its course, and the outputs would be submitted into the third activity called authorize a stage or exception plan. Now, the little dotted line that's shown in the directing a project process over here that joins these two activities together basically tells you that the moment that the second activity, authorize a project, takes place, we should then move on to the third activity, meaning to authorize a stage plan that's been created in parallel by a separate process. Now, what's not shown on this diagram, for the reasons I've already stated, is the interaction between initiating a project process and the managing a stage boundary process. But that's clearly shown in both the managing a stage boundary overview as well as the initiating a project process overview. But those are essentially the first three activities. Authorize initiation, which is reviewing the project brief, the initiation stage plan. Authorize the project, which is reviewing the project brief, pretty much, and then authorize a stage or exception plan, which will be authorizing, we're reviewing the stage plan and the other outputs of managing a stage boundary. Now, it's not a brilliantly named activity, this one, because there's a lot more happening in managing a stage boundary than simply the production of a stage plan. In actual fact, when we drill down on this activity in more detail, this will become evident, but it's the stage plan, it's the end stage report, it's the updated business case, updated project plan, updated project initiation documentation, and so on. So there's a lot more going on there, but it's called authorize a stage or exception plan. And that brings us to the point where we now have triggered the controlling a stage process, and the project will be running its course. We're building products. And now, on an ongoing basis, the project manager will be required to deal with issues during the stage and to report to the project board on a regular basis. And the fourth activity here, give ad hoc direction, is the activity where, from the controlling a stage process, there's regular feedback provided in the way of highlight reports. Also, from the controlling a stage process, there is exception reports might be raised, or issue reports might be escalated, for example. They'll always be going up into this give ad hoc direction activity. And as part of give ad hoc direction, the project board can do a number of things. They can provide guidance to the project manager and feedback into the controlling a stage process. They could seek further advice from a higher level of management, and that would ultimately be a request for advice from corporate program management of the customer that would go up into that higher level of management. Or the project board could, as part of facilitating this management by exception process, request that the project manager produce an exception plan. So that would show you this exception plan request, which in turn would then trigger the managing a stage boundary process. In other words, the current stage, which has gone into exception, will come to a close, will come to a halt. The managing a stage boundary process will be triggered right there in the middle of the stage, and an exception plan produced. Now, if managing a stage boundary produces an exception plan, it goes back up into the third activity, authorize a stage or exception plan. And if that is approved, boom, we're back down here to controlling the current stage. So this whole exception process is facilitated by the interactions that are possible here between the processes below, the third activity, authorize a stage or exception plan, and this fourth activity, give ad hoc direction. And then finally, once all is said and done and the project has run its course, then we would trigger the closing a project process naturally. Again, that natural trigger is not shown coming from the controlling a stage process, but it does exist in the method. This diagram will only show, obviously, the premature trigger, which would be where a decision has been made, potentially at corporate program level, to curtail the project. The board are informing the project manager that the project is going to be cancelled prematurely or stopped prematurely, and that means that we show the closing a project process as being triggered here from the project board. But don't forget the closing a project process, and we'll get to it in the fullness of time, but there could be a natural trigger coming across the bottom from controlling a stage. That would basically be the final activity of the process. So a relatively straightforward process that is primarily aimed at giving the project board the ability to provide overall direction and guidance to the project manager, or of the project, but still empowering the project manager to get on and manage the project on a stage by stage basis by authorizing those stage plans. But let's go now and have a look at each of these details, or each of these activities that make up the directing a project process in a little more detail. The first activity is authorize initiation. Now, you're looking at figure 15.2, and you'll recall this is being the very first activity of the directing a project process. It's the activity that takes place when the project manager submits the request to initiate the project. We know that that happens after the starting up a project process has run its course. We also know that the outputs of the starting up a project process are essentially the project brief and all of its components, together with the initiation stage plan. So this is a relatively straightforward activity. The project brief, the initiation stage plan are submitted to the board along with the project manager's request to initiate, and the board will approve the project brief, approve the stage plan, grant authority to initiate the project, and send what we call an initiation notification to corporate program management or the customer, informing them that the project is being initiated. So to summarize this activity, you can summarize it effectively by saying that the purpose of this authorized initiation activity is to review and approve the outputs of the starting up a project process. In terms of the responsibilities for carrying out this activity, fairly obviously, the project brief and the initiation stage plan, which were produced by the project manager in the starting up a project process, are reviewed by project assurance and approved by the project board. The next activity is authorize the project. And here we are looking at figure 15.3 from the manual. That request to deliver a project is the request submitted to the board when the project manager has completed the initiating a project process. And we know that the primary outputs of the initiating a project process that require approval are the project initiation documentation and the benefits management approach. The project board will also need to review the lessons log to ensure that any lessons that had been sought and learnt have been incorporated into the management approaches, for example, that form part of the PID. So, as part of authorizing this project, the board will approve the project initiation documentation, and in doing so, they approve all of the constituent parts of the project initiation documentation. So the management approaches, the plan, the project product description, and so on and so forth. They also approve the benefits management approach, grant authorization to the project manager to go ahead and deliver the project, which will be done in consultation with a review of the stage plan and product descriptions and so on for the first stage provided by management stage boundary, because this activity will also cause the activity number 3 to take place. You'll recall that little dotted line we discussed in our overview. Now, something else which could of course occur at this point is that the contents of the PID and the benefits management approach could be such that the board don't believe that the project is worth actually authorizing, that this project is not really worth delivering, in which case, in consultation again with corporate program management of the customer, the board are likely to come to a conclusion to terminate the project prematurely. And so it is a possibility that premature closure could be triggered at this point, and that would result in the triggering of the closing a project process. So again, to summarize this activity, you could say that this activity is designed primarily to review and approve the outputs of the initiating a project process. So again, with regards to the responsibilities here, table 15.2, the lessons log, which we know was created by the project manager way back in the starting up a project process, will be reviewed by all concerned to ensure those lessons have been incorporated. The project initiation documentation, which was produced by the project manager and reviewed by corporate program management of the customer and project assurance, is now approved at this point in time by the project board, as is the benefits management approach, also approved by the project board at this point in time. The next activity, which is the third activity of the directing a project process, is to authorize a stage or exception plan. Now again, this activity, the name of this activity is not misleading, but there's a lot more going on here than simply authorizing the stage or exception plan, because what we're effectively doing is authorizing or reviewing and approving, rather, the outputs of managing a stage boundary. So it's the contents of, or the outputs of managing a stage boundary, which include obviously the stage plan or exception plan, that need to be reviewed and approved, and that's great. But it's not only the stage plan or an exception plan being reviewed and approved. If nothing else, there will be an updated business case, an updated project plan, and of course our end stage report and all of its contents. Let's have a look at the diagram. You're looking at diagram 15.4. So the request to approve the exception plan or the request to approve the stage plan is what triggers this activity. And the project manager will have submitted the outputs of managing a stage boundary. Now, the end stage report will be submitted. Now, the end stage report will include, if there have been any relevant lessons learned, associated lessons reports. So they will need to be reviewed by the project board to ensure that they've been incorporated in any future plans, for example, as well as what we call the follow-on recommendations. So part of an end stage report are things called follow-on recommendations. Now, these are outstanding issues, potential risks, for example, outstanding work that's not yet complete. But this work, it's important that it does not prevent the stage from coming to an end. It's just an issue or something that needs to be monitored going forward. And the follow-on recommendations effectively notifying the project board and requesting advice as to who in particular should receive any of these relevant follow-on recommendations. Together with that, obviously, we provide the project board with the stage plan, which will include any product descriptions for products to be delivered during the next stage, or alternatively an exception plan, which again will include product descriptions. And a benefits management approach, there may, as a result of any lessons or the updated business case, for example, may have been an update to the benefits management approach. So any revised benefits management approach together with the revised project initiation documentation. So as part of managing the stage boundary, the project initiation documentation, in particular, the updated business case, the updated project plan, potentially an updated communication management approach, an updated team structure, additional role descriptions, for example, will be submitted to the board for their approval. And so the actions now on the right-hand side will be to approve the project initiation documentation in its current state, to approve the end project report, including any relevant lessons and follow-on recommendations, to approve the next stage plan, including approving any product descriptions that form part of it, as well as approving the benefits management approach if there's been any change to that. Now, having approved all of that, the project board will either provide stage authorization or authorization of the exception plan. And ultimately, if it has been an exception plan, particularly if it's been a project level exception, and we're not able to authorize the exception plan, then the board may trigger from this activity premature closure, in which case the closing a project process would start immediately after that. So one could summarize this entire activity to review and approve the outputs of the managing a stage boundary process. Let's have a look at the table of responsibilities for this activity. Of course, pretty straightforward. I mean, I hope you understand this process is being executed by project board members. So a lot of the responsibilities in the table naturally fall to the project board. So we've got specialist products confirming the approval. That's the board confirming. Those will be products that were created in the previous stage that will form part actually of the end stage report, which is also approved by the project board here. The lessons reports will be reviewed by the senior user and the senior supplier, approved by the executive. They will have been produced obviously by the project manager during the stage when the lessons were learnt. Again, any follow-on recommendations which form part of the end stage report, again, approved and distributed. The stage plan for the next stage, which was produced in managing a stage boundary by the project manager, is reviewed and approved here by the project board, reviewed by assurance. Obviously, if it's an exception plan, the same applies. And the updated project initiation documentation and the updated benefits management approach will have been updated by the project manager during managing a stage boundary, are now reviewed and approved by project assurance and project board members. There are a couple of different variations there. But just remember that these table of responsibilities are there for clarification of the recommended actions. In the narrative, it doesn't necessarily determine who's doing what. That's clarified by the table of responsibilities if you need to. Let's have a look at that next activity, give ad hoc direction. Now, give ad hoc direction, we're looking at diagram or figure 15.5 in the manual. This is that fourth activity that makes up the directing a project process. It's the one, if you recall from the walkthrough, it's not a traffic light, it's not a go, no-go point. It's simply a place whereby incoming information can be digested and responded to. Based on that information, the board can choose to do a number of things. So let's have a look at what comes in to give ad hoc direction here. So in the left-hand side, the project manager may request advice. The project board's response on the right-hand side would be to provide advice. An exception may be raised, and the board may well provide advice if that exception is raised by relaxing tolerances or providing some other advice, or may ask for an exception plan. And so the exception plan request is shown on the right-hand side here. Now, if the exception was a project level exception, the board may need to escalate that further. And so project board request for advice would be used to escalate that exception one level further. When corporate advice or decisions comes back in as a result of that, again, that would come back into the give ad hoc direction activity, and the project board may then trigger premature closure. They may give the project manager additional advice, or in fact request an exception plan to be prepared at project level. And so any incoming report, for example, the highlight report, an exception report, an issue report, any incoming report, any of these progress controls, event and time-driven controls that come in to the project board are coming in to this activity, give ad hoc direction, and the project board will react to them by one of these actions on the right-hand side, either by requesting advice, by giving advice, by requesting an exception plan, by triggering premature closure, or potentially even not as a result of an incoming communication, but don't forget the board could also raise an issue. Not all issues are raised from team managers, from project managers. Issues can come in from corporate, from the project board, from members of the public for that matter. So this is a very general ad hoc activity. Remember, it's constant, it's ongoing. It covers all communications, informal and formal, between the project manager and the board. So when the project board sit down and open their email, or a project board member opens their email and there's an email from the project manager requesting some advice, it's give ad hoc direction that is taking place. And they might simply reply to that email and click send. And essentially what has happened is there's been a request for advice and project board advice has been given, and this activity has effectively taken place. Let's look at the table of responsibilities quickly. So this table of responsibilities highlight report we know is created by the project manager during the controlling a stage process. That's reviewed by project board members. They don't get approved, these reports. Exception report, again, produced by the project manager during the controlling a stage process, reviewed by project board members and project assurance. And a new issue, as we said, could come in from multiple levels of management, either from corporate, from the executive, the senior user, or the senior supplier. Of course, they could come in from the project manager, team manager, and so on. Not going to be shown here, since this is the directing a project process. Now, the final activity of this process is to authorize project closure. Let's have a look at that final activity in a little more detail. So you'll be looking at figure 15.6 in the manual for this final activity, authorize project closure. Now, remember that this activity is taking place as a result of the closing a project process having run its course, and the closing a project process may have been triggered either under premature circumstances or under natural circumstances. It's largely speaking immaterial why it occurred. The outputs of the closing a project process will still need to be reviewed and approved, and so that's the primary purpose here. Let's have a look at each of these items on the left and understand why they're being considered as part of the activity. So you'll see the closure recommendation is what triggers the activity that's coming from the project manager to say that the activities of the closing a project process have been carried out and they're recommending project closure. It's up to the board ultimately to finally issue that. But all of the content on the left here, the updated business case, which forms part of the project initiation documentation, the end project report, which will include the lessons report and any relevant follow-on action recommendations, will be included in the end project report together with the final version of the benefits management approach. So these are updated documents, potentially updated benefits management approach. They will need to be approved. So you'll see here on the right, we approve the end project report, and in doing so, we'll approve the lessons report, approve follow-on actions or follow-on recommendations, approve the updated business case, and approve the updated benefits management approach if it has been updated. Now, if the board are satisfied that the relevant lessons have been learned, that the post-project benefit reviews have been accurately defined, and so on and so forth, then they will issue this project closure recommendation. So the closure recommendation comes in, it's a request from the project manager, and the board will issue a project closure notification, and that will go up to corporate program management or the customer. It's effectively a note saying the project has run its course, the project's products have been handed over, the customer has accepted the product, and the project has nothing more to offer, essentially. So to summarize this activity, essentially review and approve the updates of the closing a project process. Let's have a look at this table of responsibilities. So the end project report is approved. We know that the project manager created that in the closing a project process. The lessons report is distributed. That was produced again by the project manager as part of the end stage report in the closing a project process. Any follow-on action recommendations are distributed. They again were created by the project manager as part of the end project report in the closing a project process, approved by the board. And then the final updated version of the business case, reviewed by project assurance and approved by the executive, and a final version of the benefits management approach is now reviewed by project assurance, the senior user and the senior supplier, together with corporate program management of the customer, approved by the executive, and ownership of the benefits management approach is now transferred to corporate program management of the customer. And the person who is likely to be taking ownership of the benefits management approach is likely to be the same person who was acting as the senior user, because remember, the senior user specified the benefits that the business case was based on and is now going to be held to account for realizing the benefits post-project. So those are the activities that make up the directing a project process, looked at in a little bit more detail. And I hope from that explanation there that you appreciate the important role that the give ad hoc direction and the authorize a stage or exception plan activities, those third and fourth activities. I hope you appreciate the important role that those two play in the facilitation of management by exception, or the principle of management by exception, since they essentially allow the exception process to take place. Now, there are no management products created during the directing a project process necessarily. The project board are not responsible for creating any documents themselves. They will, of course, as part of pretty much all of the activities, be approving management products. So the first activity, for example, authorize initiation, approves the project brief, all of its contents, and the initiation stage plan. The second activity, authorize the project, that essentially approves the project initiation documentation, all of its contents, and the benefits management approach, and so on and so forth. But no documents created per se by this process specifically. But documents are authorized, they're reviewed, and they will be approved during this process. Let's consider now aspects of the directing a project process which can be tailored to suit different projects. So as we've just stated, the directing a project process is a decision-making process. It approves the management products created elsewhere, and it's used for authorizing progression through the project as we authorize each stage along the way. And as part of authorize the project, that second activity, the project board will approve the proposed tailoring requirements as part of approving the project initiation documentation. In other words, they're approving the manner in which the method has been tailored. Now, to this extent, the project board will be aware of the tailoring and will need to ensure and confirm that the directing a project process itself is compatible with other tailoring that has been done. Again, care will need to be taken to ensure the integrity of the interfaces between the directing a project process and other processes. Now, the degree of formality of this process will, largely speaking, be determined by the degree of formality of the management products produced in the other processes. But regardless of the degree of formality, evidence of any decisions should always be traceable for audit purposes and may take the form of minutes for meetings, emails, or, of course, more formal authorizations, which may be issued by the project board. In terms of the roles, all of the activities of the process, although executed in consultation with other members of the project board, are for the accountability of the executive. And while the executive may delegate other people to actually carry out the work, remember that the project manager may not make any decisions or provide any approvals on matters which are the responsibility of the executive, since the roles of the executive and the project manager are kept completely separate. In a program environment, it's possible that the program manager could, of course, fulfill the role of the executive and may even be the executive on a number of projects within the program. In larger scale projects, such as those we've discussed in program environments, or even in projects where there is a phased release of funding on a stage-by-stage basis, as an example, this activity to authorize a stage or exception plan may actually be carried out at a management level higher than that of the executive. And so this activity may in fact be perceived from our project as a completely separate process taking place at a different level of management outside of the project at hand. Now, in a very simple project, much of the directing a project process is likely to be quite quick and quite informal, and may even, for example, take place at site meetings with verbal approvals being given directly to the project manager and confirmed later in an email, for example. So in more complex environments where decisions are likely to take longer to be made, this is, could result in, or as a result of the formality of the decision-making process, the different requirements will obviously need to be considered in the planning of the project and, of course, in the planning of each stage. And they're likely to have a bearing on the momentum of the project. Okay, well, that wraps it up for the directing a project process. Don't forget to complete the relevant questions from the sample paper 1 in the resources area. And again, you may need to reread the scenario if you've had a break from your study. So don't forget to watch the rationale videos that take you through the answers, through the thinking behind the questions, and importantly, will address some additional learning points. Once you've completed them, come back and join me in the next module.